this jointly hosted event between History and Policy and the Mile End Institute on the autumn 2022 financial crisis in historical perspective. I have to warn you that we are slightly depleted in terms of speakers. We're going to try and generate just as much intellectual energy. Unfortunately, Catherine Schenk and Duncan Weldon have both come down with illness and had to cancel at very much the last minute. But we have with us Tim Bale and Duncan Needham. And Tim will be covering the political side, Duncan the financial side. But I would encourage you I know there's a huge amount of expertise in this room beyond the panels, so it will very much be a kind of an open discussion. I'd like to thank Colin Murphy, no relation, who is Deputy Director of the Mile End Institute, for helping to organise this event. I'm Philip Murphy. I'm Director of History and Policy. Tim Bale, I'm sure you will all know, is Professor of Politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary College. In 2011, he won the W.J.M. Mackenzie Prize for the Conservative Party from Thatcher to Cameron, and he's been staggeringly, shamefully prolific, with books on the Conservatives since 1945, the Labour Party under Ed Miliband, and foot soldiers, political party membership in the 21st century. He was involved in no less than three books published in 2021, including one very topically on riding the populist wave, Europe's mainstream writing crisis. And he is currently finishing a book on the Conservative Party after Brexit, which I think has a March 2023 publication date on Amazon. Duncan Needham is an old friend and Deputy Director of History and Policy. Duncan worked as a credit trader at JP Morgan and fund manager at Cairn Capital before returning to academia in 2008. He's been Director of the Centre for Financial History at Darwin College, Cambridge since 2013 and Senior Tutor since 2016. Again, a prolific scholar. His work covering British monetary and financial policy, including his 2014 book, UK Monetary Policy from Devaluation to Thatcher, 1967 to 82. So I will ask Tim and then Duncan to speak for about 10 minutes or so with some opening thoughts. We might encourage a discussion between them and then throw the discussion out to the floor. So please store up some questions and comments while Tim and Duncan speak. Tim.
Thank you very much, Philip. Okay. I would like to talk about the fact that economic crises and financial crises are often as much about the symbols involved as the substance involved. And I'd also like to stress that they always have a party political dimension, not just in the sense of competition between parties, but actually competition and tensions within parties. But they can also obviously present opportunities for political actors to make arguably much needed shifts in policy, and not just in economic policy, but also in policy more widely, particularly perhaps foreign policy in the case that I'm going to look at. So in 2022, for example, as we know, the disaster that befell the mini budget, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, gave Labour the chance to mount a very persuasive critique, I think, of Tory government incompetence and also allowed them to mount a critique once again of the intentions of the Conservative Party, partly because the mini-budget was, the crisis of the mini-budget was to some extent precipitated by the tax cuts for the rich as they were billed by Labour. But also, of course, as we know, because Kwasi Kwarteng suggested that there was more to come, a warning, I think, about needing to be very, very definite when you are making these statements. It's also, however, perhaps a little bit of a double-edged sword for Labour, in the sense, and many of you will pick this up in media commentary, that what happened in the autumn of 22 is seen as testimony to the power of the markets, and has also reinforced this idea that there is, quote unquote, a black hole in government finances which will limit the ability of any party, should they get into government, to actually fulfil some of the promises that they make. And were Simon Lewis here, he will no doubt say that the way that this has been covered, particularly by newspapers, but also by broadcasters, it's an example of what he calls media macro. In other words, the idea, and we're all very familiar with this, that somehow the nation's finances are like those of a household, and therefore we are limited as to what we can do, since we cannot borrow above and beyond a certain limit. Indeed, perhaps we should not borrow at all, as far as some broadcasters seem to be concerned. But 2022 obviously gave Sunak and his supporters the chance to say "I told you so" to Liz Truss, and the chance for them to shift policy back towards fiscal conservatism that Sunak had always seen himself as embodying. It also clearly gave Boris Johnson and his supporters a chance, in some senses, also to say "I told you so," après-moi le déluge, as it were, but also a chance for him to make some kind of comeback. In the end, he decided not to, but he is still supposedly waiting in the wings. And of course, it gave the current Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, a chance really to come back from the political dead. Nobody, I thought, gave Jeremy Hunt much of a chance of actually standing in certainly one of the biggest offices of state before he was parachuted in by Liz Truss in order to try and rescue her premiership and rescue the credibility of the British government. In terms of the historical perspective, I thought what I'd do is have a look back at the devaluation of 1967, partly because it's actually something that I wrote about way back when I was doing my PhD, and I also managed to write an article for 20th Century British History called Dynamics of a Non-Decision, which was about why the Labour government didn't in fact devalue in a way that many people, particularly in hindsight, thought it should have done in 1964. Partly as well because it illustrates some of the points I've just been making. In terms of the background to that crisis, we have a decision made very early on, indeed before Labour came into government, by Callaghan, who was to become the Chancellor, Wilson, who was to become Prime Minister, and George Brown, who, if you remember, headed up something which was trying to remove the power of the Treasury, the DEA, but didn't actually, in the end, come off. But the decision was to preserve the parity of the pound at $2.80. The reason being partly to avoid Labour being saddled with the reputation of a devaluation party, because after all this had happened during the 1940s. They didn't really want to give the Conservatives any chance to run the narrative that you couldn't trust Labour with the currency, that Labour was not a party of sound finance. They also worried actually about the diplomatic and the international markets repercussions of devaluing, and the repercussions indeed for the entire financial system, of which the UK, because its sterling balances, was more of an integral part perhaps than it is today. But there are other reasons as well. They wanted to avoid the very difficult measures that a devaluation would have involved, particularly perhaps for some of Labour's key electorates and supporters, given that the impact on price rises and the impact on real wages that would have. obviously reinforced in that in some ways by the fact that they had a majority of under 5 when they came in '64. And there was also a feeling, I think, among some of Wilson's advisors, and indeed Wilson, Brown and Callaghan, that somehow what they saw as kind of socialist structural reforms were the solution to Britain's problems rather than the so-called easy way out of devaluation. But of course, as you know, it became increasingly apparent over time that that parity could not be held. And in November 1967, the pound was devalued. I'm in some senses more interested, however, in what followed, which was a package of spending cuts, or at least reductions to spending growth, put through in January 1968. A very painful process actually for that Labour government, akin in some ways to the process that the Labour government had to go through in the mid-70s. Also actually involved the IMF, and it always, in some senses, raises a wry smile with me when people talk about the IMF crisis in the 70s, because actually the IMF was very involved in the crisis of 1967, 1968. But I think that package illustrates the point I was making, first of all, which is, symbolic politics is incredibly important in these kind of financial crises. That package, which involved Britain, for example, withdrawing from its bases east of Suez, as it used to be called, and also making some spending cuts in some areas that people saw as quintessentially socialist, was in some ways a way of the UK finally getting real in some senses about empire. So there was this opportunity that was seized in some ways by the Labour government, or some people within the Labour government, as I go on to say. But it was very important for the government to show the international community that it was balancing the books rather than sticking to what some, certainly in the international community, would have seen as unrealistic socialist values. And in particular, that was symbolised by the decision to reverse a historic decision in 1964 to make National Health Service prescriptions free. If any of you can remember that far back, you may remember that actually Harold Wilson himself had resigned from the 45 to 51 government on the issue of NHS charges, and it became very much a point of contention between the Bevonites on the left of the Labour Party and the Gateskites on the Social Democratic right of the Labour Party. And in some senses, sacrificing that particular sacred cow was a way of the government communicating to the outside world that it was prepared, as it were, to do sort of symbolic violence to its own values and its own socialist supporters in pursuit of financial credibility. You could also argue that perhaps the government thought that if it threw this particular bone to the international markets and creditors, that it would actually save it from having to make rather more substantial, substantive, I should say, savings. And whether that worked or not is open to debate. But in terms of Labour's internal politics, and this is where I think there are more resonances with what we've just seen, it was a chance for those on the sort of social democratic Gateskiite right of the Labour Party to suggest that the grown-ups were back in charge of the government's policy, because you had Callaghan, who was never seen obviously as on the left, but still rather different, because very much as a trade union background, was replaced by Roy Jenkins as Chancellor. And Roy Jenkins was definitely one who stressed, and this is where we see another resonance, competence and responsibility over ideology. That was very much his line. And it was Roy Jenkins who really seized the chance, I think, to shift away from Britain's, if you like, imperial pretensions, imperial delusions, towards the European future that he was very strongly in favour of. And that was done in part, as I say, by withdrawing from east of Suez and the savings that would involve. but also because of the cancellation of a big fighter aircraft project with the United States for F-111s, which had Dennis Healey, who was also, by the way, a Social Democrat, very, very angry indeed. He was very much an Atlanticist in the way that Roy Jenkins was not. Possibly also another impact of this was that it strengthened the government's determination to keep out of Vietnam as well. And in fact, Roy Jenkins probably, if he pushed hard enough, as he later confessed, could perhaps have even toppled Harold Wilson and become Prime Minister. He chose not to do so, not confident enough of the support that he had in the party. But of course, that's intra-party politics. We're also interested in inter-party politics, in other words, between Labour and the Conservatives. And clearly, again, there are resonances there as well, because that financial crisis really did hit Labour support very badly. Labour was already, if you like, coming off the 1966 victory. Its polling had headed south, but not that fast since then. But certainly after the devaluation, it took a very big hit. Partly, some would argue, because of Wilson's famous pound in your pocket speech, which didn't really go down very well or very persuasively with most people, but more likely because of the competence shock. And if you're interested in politics, it's worth reading the work of Jane Green and Will Jennings on competence and valence judgments of voters. They're still very, very important, I think, although we've heard a lot in recent times about how competence and considerations of competence have been replaced by, if you like, competition over values and cultural issues. I still think the economy and economic competence is incredibly important, and we've seen a comeback in some ways because of that. And if you look, for example, at the Labour Party's performance at the local elections of 1968, they were absolutely crucified by the Conservatives. And I think we can probably expect to see the same in the forthcoming local elections next year. And actually it helped the opposition leader through what would have been possibly some quite difficult times. This was the time when Enoch Powell was, to say the least, playing up within the Conservative Party, and Ted Heath, having won the leadership in 65 but lost the election in 66, was, there were many doubts about his leadership among Conservative MPs, and I think, as usual, an opposition leader cannot help but benefit from any crisis that the government and the Prime Minister goes through. And it also, of course, gave the Conservatives a chance once again to run the kind of socialism is profligacy and incompetence line that worked so effectively. And here I'll be kind of coming to an end, because I think it's interesting that the Labour government spent the next 2 or 3 years trying to regain the government's reputation for competence and credibility, partly through economic growth, partly through something that was incredibly important then, but seems to be less important now, but you might tell me different, of course, which was the balance of payments. And the idea that as long as that was okay, then almost everything else was okay. But interestingly, of course, in the end, an attempt to reassert competence, to reassert credibility by quote-unquote responsible policies failed to win Labour the election in 1970. Yes, you can say that it was all to do with some jumbo jets right at the end of that particular period. You can go into that if you like. But actually, I think what it says is that although it is quite understandable that a government, after a crisis like this, tries its best through so-called responsible policies to reassert its reputation for competence, actually what tends to happen, and I think we saw this obviously in 1992 to 1997 as well, that hit to its reputation is so great that in the end, whatever it does, it's very, very difficult to recover.
Thank you very much indeed. Pass on to Duncan Weldon.
Thank you very much, Tim. There's a couple of points I want to just pick up on in my comments. One is the opportunities for policy shifts that you touched upon at the beginning, and the other is the importance of competence and credibility. So those are two thoughts that I'm going to have in the back of my mind when I go through a couple of historical episodes. So I had, unlike Tim, who has a very prolific media career, I had a 2-week media career that started on the 23rd of September and finished with the appointment of Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And the phone suddenly started ringing on the 23rd of September because various media commentators were quite rightly drawing a direct parallel with 1972 and the dash for growth. So I'm going to talk about 1972 in the beginning of my remarks. Because 1972, 50 years ago, that was the biggest fiscal injection that we'd seen until the 23rd of September. Now, obviously, much of that has been reversed since. So I'll talk a little bit about the motivation for the Barber boom, what happened in the 1972 budget and how it ended up. And I guess there are a few people in the audience who will have first-hand memories of this, and perhaps we can go into that in discussion. So Barber, and this is really more Ted Heath's budget. Barber was not Heath's original choice for Chancellor. Ian Cloud was. Ian Cloud died after, I think, about 6 weeks, and died in office. But Cloud had been Shadow Chancellor, I think, since about 1965, and was Heath's first choice. Barber, I think, had been Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and he was heavily involved in the negotiations that would ultimately see Britain join what was then the European Economic Community. The story goes that when Barber got the call, he said, "Oh God, I hope he doesn't make me Chancellor of the Exchequer." Well, he did make him Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he had a very unhappy time of it. So it was really Heath's boom much more than it was Barber's boom. Now, some of the context for that Heath-Barber boom was you had an economy that looked like it was growing about 1%. In 1971. The figures have subsequently rise up a little more, but if you look at the numbers that policymakers were looking at in 1971, they thought the economy was growing at about 1%. They thought the economy could and should have been growing at about 3.5%. So they thought they had an output gap. So they injected 2%, an estimated 2% of GDP in the 1972 budget. Dr. Kwarteng was going to inject 1.5%, so just to put that in a historical parallel. Now, one of the other differences, Tim, you already referred to the 23rd of September fiscal event as a budget for the rich, and it very much was. I mean, the Resolution Foundation calculated, I think, that 2/3 of the benefits were going to go to the top 20% of earners, with 45% going to the top 5% of earners. Barber did something very different in 1972. 75% of the fiscal stimulus came from income tax cuts. But what Barber did was he didn't move the basic rate or the upper rates and the various different rates of income tax in 1972. What he did was he changed the allowances. So the single person's allowance rose by 41% in that budget. It was a very broad-based income tax cut, but it was done through raising the tax-free allowances. Married couple, I think, was about 28%, but single person. So basically, it was a very broad-based tax cut. So unless you were in the very low end of the earnings spectrum, pretty much everybody got a tax cut. There were a few other bits. There was accelerated depreciation of industrial equipment. Heath was desperate for an industrial boom, and there were interest payments above 35% for individuals were made tax deductible, which kind of made monetary policy very difficult because it meant that you were mad not to borrow, basically in the early 1970s, and we saw an enormous property boom on the back of it. There's another bit of context, which I touched upon already. Britain was about to join the European Economic Community. We're about to join a group of nations where Germany, France, even Italy are growing at 5-6%. Britain's growing at a historically pretty good clip for us, just above 3%, but we're joining a group of nations that are growing at a much faster rate. So Heath wants to sort of exhort the economy onto a higher growth plane. And the stated goal in the 1972 budget was that the British economy should grow by 5% real GDP for 2 years. So financial year 72-73 and financial year 73-74. So it shows how our ambitions have been clipped since then. Dr. Kwarteng's goal was that we should grow at 2.5% over the medium term. In 1972, it didn't seem completely unreasonable that we should be growing at 5%. Now, in some senses, he got what he wanted. We got about 10% growth in those 2 years. 6.3%, I think, growth in 1972-73, about 4% growth the following year. The problem is you cannot grow the British economy at 6.3% without stoking up all sorts of inflationary pressures. Current account, Tim mentioned the current account. We had an enormous current account deficit even before the price of oil quadrupled after the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. So we're running an enormous current account deficit. Current account deficits mattered in those days. You barely hear people talking about the current account deficit today, even though we have an enormous current account deficit. And the current account deficits were the best predictor of which countries got into trouble before the global financial crisis in 2008. So we were running an enormous current account deficit as a consequence of the dash for growth. Now, it's very rare for a chancellor to call time on their own boom, but that's what Anthony Barber had to do. He sort of dabbed his foot on the brake in July 1973, but reversed a lot of the measures in December 1973. Now, I said that my media career came to an end after about 2 weeks, and that's because the context moved on. And nobody's really talking about the dash for growth anymore because a lot of the measures announced on 23rd September have been reversed. So I think the more accurate historical analogy, the recent historical analogy perhaps, is Black Wednesday in 1992. And it's leading on to Tim's point about credibility and competence. To misquote an old Turkish proverb, credibility arrives on a tortoise and leaves on a galloping horse. And that's what it felt like on the 23rd of September. We saw what the market reaction to the mini budget was. We saw long-dated gilts yields rising nearly 1%. We saw practically overnight the cost of servicing the UK government debt rising by about 10 billion quid. These are large numbers. Now, clearly, the policy of being in the ERM was very, very different to the policy of Kwarteng's mini budget. But it's the fact of the central plank of a government's macroeconomic policy being completely removed that I think is the parallel. Now, I had a certain amount of sympathy in 1992 because you can, I think, credibly bring in events that were external to the UK government. German reunification. We locked ourselves against the Deutschmark with 2 Deutschmarks in 1995, and the Germans reunified and borrowed a lot of money to try and get the East German economy up to something approaching West German levels very, very quickly. That obviously led to enormous strains within the RM. Britain's already in recession. The Germans are raising rates. We don't want to raise rates, and so that the whole thing sort of falls apart. And that, to me, seems to be in stark contrast to what happened on the 23rd of September, which seemed to be almost entirely self-inflicted. I think it's very difficult to blame anybody else. But I just want to finish on where we go from here, because obviously, like many people, I'm an avid listener of Philip Johnson, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and he's been very depressing recently because taxes are at the highest rate they've been since the 1950s, and Philip has been across the media recently saying they're going to stay there, probably for decades. And so what it feels like is the British interwar economy. Churchill, Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1924 till 1929, complained that debt and high taxation was smothering the British economy like a wet blanket, smothering entrepreneurialism, smothering growth. And if you look at the impact of the global financial crisis and the COVID pandemic on the national debt, just looking at the graph, it looks like a major war in terms of the national debt as a percentage of GDP going from, I think it bottomed out at about 39% under the new Labour government to we're about 100%, give or take today. And that was obviously fueled the market jitters about what happened on the 23rd of September, because it's one thing to launch a dash for growth, as Barber did with debt to GDP at around 50%. It's very much another thing to launch unfunded tax cuts, debt-fueled tax cuts, when your debt to GDP is already at 100%. But it just feels, where we go forward from here, it feels a bit like we're going to be in a high debt, high tax, probably low growth economy for years to come now. And that feels a bit like the interwar period. To me, there are lots of similarities to the interwar period. There are as many people could point out many differences. We probably have a more flexible labour market today than we had in the interwar period. But it's not an optimistic scenario. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. For those who came a little bit late, I mentioned at the beginning that we're two of our promised speakers, Catherine Schenk and Duncan Weldon, were taken ill and unfortunately couldn't join us. So we've got a bit more time for discussion, and so I'll stop wandering around with the microphone in a few minutes. So please get some questions ready. I'll put your hands up and I'll come to you. I was just sort of remembering that September, it all has sort of receded back into memory a little bit, although not the consequences. And I was wondering, I was looking back, because of course with Twitter you can sort of trace where you were at any particular moment. I remember wandering around Regent's Park, a rather lovely early autumn evening, 29th of September, with all hell breaking out in the government, wondering how much longer Truss would last. And this, from the back of my memory, this famous line from Douglas Hurd from the early 70s, when Hurd was Edward Heath's PPS. The government are now wandering vainly over a battlefield, looking for someone to surrender to, and being massacred all the time. And I tweeted that, and of course he was talking about more specifically the battle with the miners, rather than the kind of the reversal of the dash for growth. But it seemed very, I mean, one of the problems, I think, looking for historical precedents for what happened in September, is that arguably there aren't really any. It was so humiliating, so brutal, so incompetent. And the question is, how did we actually get there? Was it that the Tories, I mean, no one's really, neither Tim nor Duncan have mentioned the B word very much, but was it that the Tories actually had to push Brexit to its logical conclusion and to kind of hit that brick wall? Because it does feel, as a kind of historian, that we've hit one of those turning points, really crucial turning points in the debate about Brexit, because of what happened in September. But how do you know, the sort of the Truss phenomenon, is this about a kind of degradation of British politics or British administration of Whitehall? You know, I was listening to Nick Robinson's very good Radio 4 documentary about this. Staggering how it worked, you know. How are you going to explain that in your forthcoming book?
Well, I mean, I do think you make a very good point there about Brexit, actually, because I mean, I think, as we know, within the Conservative Party, there were many different versions of Brexit. There was a kind of sovereigntist version, which was about taking back control of borders, you know, realigning the British electorate in some senses along that kind of cultural dimension rather than any kind of economic dimension, and it worked very well in 2019 for Boris Johnson. But of course there were always people in the Conservative Party, as you know, and ironically Liz Truss, although she voted Remain rather reluctantly, became one of them, who believed that the point of Brexit, and the only point of Brexit, was somehow to, you know, free Britain from being, as they sometimes put it, shackled to a corpse of the EU. By that they meant that they would be able to deregulate the British economy, move the British economy towards a much more low tax, low spending kind of political economy. In other words, to put it very bluntly, I suppose, make the United Kingdom more like the United States in that sense. And I do think that you know, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, who did actually support Brexit, were in some senses the kind of final realisation, the apotheosis of that particular take on Brexit. And you know, the mini budget was in some senses their attempt to put that spin that philosophy of Brexit into practice. I think that's absolutely right. But as you both said, extraordinarily incompetent in the sense that they were warned. I think that in order to do this, they would need to balance the package with some kind of spending cuts. But they'd spent really some years under Boris Johnson believing that they could have their cake and eat it. So I think what happened in the mini budget was in a sense a kind of a collision between, on the one hand, that take on Brexit, and on the other hand, a party and politicians who had got used to thinking that they could do almost anything and pull it off through smoke and mirrors. And unfortunately, that didn't turn out to be the case. I mean, I do think there is a very interesting counterfactual there, although I generally don't do a lot of counterfactual history, but I know it's quite appealing. Had Kwasi Kwarteng not done the more to come, stuff over the weekend, and had perhaps they listened to people who said you need to say something more on the spending side during the mini budget, then perhaps it wouldn't have been quite the disaster that it was. I do think it's very interesting that the Conservative Party's reaction changed very, very quickly. Although you had in that documentary, and I would really recommend it, it's the archive on 4. If you didn't listen to it on I think it's Saturday night, isn't it, at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, so you can listen again. You have, I think it's been one of the Conservative Party MPs saying that there was a kind of horror on the Conservative benches about what they were witnessing. But actually, he himself wrote, I think, an article, was quoted in an article saying, what a great idea the mini budget was. And there are an awful lot of Conservative MPs who only discovered what a terrible idea the whole thing had been after the whole thing turned to custard over the weekend. So, I think there are a lot of Conservative MPs actually who bought into this idea of Brexit, and certainly some of the work that we did when I was at UK Changing Europe to survey Conservative MPs indicated that many of them did have this view of Brexit. For example, a surprising number of them, to me, in fact it was a majority of them, thought that trade deals with the United States, China and India would be able to replace the trade that we had lost with the European Union. They felt perfectly confident about that, and perfectly confident that Brexit would actually benefit the UK economy. So I think there's an awful lot of hindsight on the part of Conservative MPs who somehow didn't discover, as I said, that this mini budget was a bad thing until it was.
Thank you. If you haven't read this rather marvellous book by Bill Keegan, David Marsh and Richard Roberts, 6 Days in September, I absolutely commend it to you. When I was gathering my thoughts ahead of this event, I reread it over the weekend. And two of them are professional journalists, so it's incredibly readable. And Bill's been reporting on financial matters since the South Sea bubble as well. So he brings a wealth of experience to it. They suggest in here that there's a fairly unbroken line from Black Wednesday through to Brexit, and if indeed the fiscal event was the sort of end of that, then that would chime. I kept hearing about this idea of we're going to be Singapore. London's going to be Singapore on Thames, and that if we can just sort of deregulate our way to higher growth. But I also read a comparison was that London could possibly be Singapore on Thames, but London has a bit that looks a bit like Portugal attached to it, and that's the rest of the country. I mean, London has been growing at 2.5% GDP per capita, and will continue to probably grow at 2.5% GDP per capita. But there's a big chunk of the rest of Britain that doesn't grow quite that fast. I just wanted to say a bit about who Treasury ministers were and were not listening to in the build-up to the fiscal event on the 23rd of September, because we do have at least one Treasury representative here who can tell me if I get this wrong. But certainly for a spring budget, there's a pretty well-established timetable, in that the political ministers and their advisors will go to Dorneywood or wherever it is in very early January and sort of draft out what political measures they want to take in the budget, and then very senior Treasury people will be drawn in, and then the bank will be drawn in, and there's a timetable we follow. Now, as far as I understand it, we know that the Office of Budget Responsibility wasn't, no OBR forecast was published, and as far as I'm aware, the bank was not brought in to the discussion before the 23rd of September. And for somebody who's spent more time than is healthy in the archives looking at how budgets have been constructed over the last half century, I find this quite remarkable, genuinely remarkable. So who were they talking to? Well, apparently there was a meeting at, I think, Dorneywood, where Andrew Lillico was there. Now, I mentioned my brief fluorescence of a media career, which mostly involved going on at Radio 5 at 6:04 in the morning before Radio 5 kicks into its daily diet of constant football punditry and commentary. But I remember the presenter saying, we haven't managed to get anybody to come on and defend this fiscal event. Then lo and behold, at 7 o'clock, Andrew Lillico popped up to defend it. And Andrew Lillico is a sort of young version of Patrick Minford, who seems to be the person that they go to when they need a sort of, economically literate Brexiteer. Now, apparently Andrew Lillico was at this meeting at Dorneywood, as were a bunch of hedge fund managers. And it just strikes me as quite remarkable that, the sort of economic specialists at the bank and the OBR were excluded from the discussions. But you've got hedge fund managers included in the discussions. And that to me, I think, speaks volumes.
Yeah, sure. And
One thing I forgot to say, actually, in response to something that Philip said, and I guess it contradicts in some ways what I was saying before, although I do think in some ways this should prompt a reappraisal of British policy when it comes to Brexit from the government. I rather fear that it won't, because it has simply become impossible within the Conservative Party to cast any doubt on whether Brexit is a good idea, or indeed even to suggest that okay, we're not going to rejoin the European Union, but there are ways of actually getting closer to the European Union and making compromises that would see some improvements in trade and trade facilitation. But we are blocked in some senses from making those kinds of changes because of this omerta in some ways about Brexit. So although I've said it would be great, and it very often happens that these crises allow politicians to grasp opportunities, it seems to me that this government is probably incapable of grasping that opportunity and making any kind of shift.
Thank you very much. Con, you had a question. This supposedly roving mic doesn't seem to work. So let's see if we can how the acoustics of this room work. And if necessary, I'll take this.
Wave if you can't hear me. Well, that will definitely break it.
Yeah.
Thanks to the whole panel for really, really interesting reflections. I have two questions. One that might be more towards Tim, and one that might be more towards Duncan, but honestly, answer whichever you want. Yeah. So the one to Tim is about the symbol point. If that analogy holds, what would be the symbol today for the current Conservative Party? And we've already seen their attempts to regain credibility. So what, from your reading of the hastily arranged financial statement and the new budget, what would you say they're trying to make the symbol of their return to rectitude? And then perhaps more interestingly, if there's a change of government, what would a Labour government or a Labour-led government, what do you think they would choose? What would they try and protect from their emerging policy platform, particularly on some quite expensive commitments on the green transition, but also they're looking at collapsing public sector, pay claims from trade unions. if they're going to have to make some kind of symbolic sacrifice, what do you think they are going to choose? What do you think they're going to get away with? So that's the question for you, but also to the other two, if they want to answer it. And then to Duncan, on, I mean, it is interesting thinking about all these different analogies. One major difference with all of them, with the possible exception of 2008, is a major institutional change, which is now monetary policy and fiscal policy are at least formally separated operationally, right? Because certainly in the Barber boom, and Tim was talking about devaluation policy, interest rates were controlled ultimately by the Chancellor. Now, of course, the Bank of England has semi-independence, certainly operational independence. And one of the striking things about the autumn crisis was the massive incoherence at the heart of UK economic policy making. While the bank was trying to restrain growth, the Treasury was, or at least the Treasury political masters were trying to unleash growth. Now that's reduced now, but I wonder if you could reflect a bit on what that institutional change does for our ability to draw lessons from the earlier periods. I mean, are we entering uncharted territory? Thank you.
Did you catch that?
Yeah.
Good.
Done.
I mean, that is a fascinating question. I mean, I think on the first, which is a much easier one to answer, the first part of your question to me, clearly, it was the fact that the tax cut was reversed, and it was the reversal of the 45p tax cut, I think, 40p tax cut. That in some senses did, I think, serve the same function as prescription charges, the Labour Party. In that, rightly or wrongly, it became something of a shibboleth for Conservatives, and has done really since the 1980s, that the party is a tax-cutting party. And in particular, I think for those who believe that our problem is that we are less like America than we need to be, then I think that kind of tax cuts promoting entrepreneurs and incentivising people to do more, particularly at the top end of the spectrum, is very 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 important part of Tory ideology. So reversing that, I think, very quickly. Was the equivalent there. I mean, interestingly, they chose not to make any change to the abolition of the national insurance rises, which would have actually raised a fair bit of money, and of course was supposedly vital when Boris Johnson was around and Rishi Sunak was his Chancellor to NHS finances, and indeed then the government's plans on social care, although of course they've delayed the changes on social care. Quite why they did that, I don't know. It seemed to me an obvious thing to do. I suppose perhaps they were worried about taking too much money out of the economy. It's one thing to cut taxes, and it's another to, I suppose, impose taxes on an economy going into recession. So there may have been a good economic reason not to do that. In terms of what Labour could sacrifice, I really can't answer that question. I mean, I think it's a really good question. It's one that they need to be thinking about just in case. I mean, one would hope, I guess, that a Labour government wouldn't immediately come under the kind of pressure that this Truss and Kwarteng face. But I mean, it's perfectly possible. And as I say, when I was making my presentation, I think there is a danger that the Labour Party is spooked by what has happened and decides to rein back any ambitions it may have had for fear of coming under precisely the kind of pressure that you're talking about. But whether they are planning to suggest something that they can then reverse, I think they're probably not quite as Machiavellian as that, although perhaps they should be.
Thanks, Colin. Just thinking about the separation of monetary and fiscal policy, because obviously during the dash for growth, we had very loose monetary policy and we had very loose fiscal policy. You're not going to get to 26.9% year-on-year inflation in August 1975 unless they're both loose. And how did we get down from that high level of inflation? Well, it was by having tight monetary policy and tight fiscal policy. And it was the same after devaluation. The 1968 budget was called at the time the tightest budget in Britain's post-war history, as it then was. And in a sense, Roy Jenkins was almost unfireable Because to lose one chancellor, two is deemed as carelessness. So in a way, I think Jeremy Hunt is probably really pretty secure, because you can't lose two. One of many things I found interesting leading into the 23rd of September was just the opprobrium that Liz Truss in particular threw at the bank. And this constantly repeated statement during the leadership election that monetary policy is the preserve of the bank. If interest rates go up, if your mortgage goes up, blame the bank. And to sort of deflect that political heat. That's the bank's job. That's the bank's job. And the bank did raise interest rates, and will continue to raise interest rates until inflation starts to come down. And the bank did step in to try and sort out what was going on in pension funds and LDIs and the gilt market. I suppose in a way, the OBR is more important now, isn't it? Because you're not going to make that mistake again, are you? People are going to be hanging on the OBR's every word now. So I think monetary policy is tighter, and it's going to have to be tighter. Fiscal policy is going to have to be tighter, because you have almost tested it to destruction. And you have to have, what gets us out of the inflation of the 1970s? Incomes policy, remember incomes policy. It's tight monetary policy, it's tight fiscal policy, and it is tight incomes policy, which then leads to the winter of discontent. But you've got to have policy all pulling in the same direction. You can't have loose or tight monetary policy, loose fiscal policy, otherwise you're going to have that incoherence that we had on the 23rd of September. So they've got to be both pulling in the right direction, and I think they will be going forward.
Have we got an incomes policy now?
Well, in the public sector, I suppose we have. Yes, that's why we've got striking nurses, striking railwomen, striking ambulance drivers, everybody else. Yeah.
We've got loads of questions. There was someone right at the back who was, you had your hand up for a while. Do you want to?
Yeah, I just temporarily slagged off the hedge fund community. I thought somebody needs to defend them. So you've moved very quickly into Brexit, just sitting there as somebody who has to fund the bridge deficit and manages the bond fund. There's a small matter of vast borrowing over COVID. So from where I would sit in the world, COVID was a much bigger impact than any dreams of the Tory party post Brexit or what they're attempting to achieve. I would also just like to point out, having worked in Singapore, it's actually a very tightly managed economy. It's not Hong Kong seems to be what they seem to have in mind when people mention it. I would also just say, as somebody who also has to deal with the European Union, if you're looking for an even bigger debt mess, I would say that they have got it, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out in the next 18 months. And the final thing is, just on your point of Brexit, if you think the trade deficits are going to come back, which I suspect they will, locking yourself into the single market, where you seem to have actually embedded an ever-growing current account deficit, it's not particularly great policy to have. I know I sound like a Brexiteer, but I'm just here to finance the deficit.
I'm glad someone's standing up for hedge fund managers. Duncan, you're the...
I don't disagree with much of what you've said. And going back to one of Tim's early points, the thing about Singapore is a myth. Singapore is as we know, is a very, very heavy regulated place, but that's not how it's presented in much of the literature. So symbols are important, but myths are also important.
The gentleman here.
Bill Allen. Duncan talked about the Barber Group, which was indeed a pretty exact parallel with the Truss squatting event. I think there's another precedent, which was Harold Macmillan, who once he got rid of his first chancellor. We can't hear Harold Macmillan, who got rid of his first chancellor, Peter Thornycroft, who made subduing inflation a kind of mission and wanted a tighter budget than Macmillan was prepared to provide. And after that, which was in the beginning of 1958, he had a series of compliant chancellors whom he bullied into pursuing expansionary policies of one kind or another and aimed at a growth target of 4%. And that was that led to the problems which beset Labour when they were elected in 1964. The points I wanted to make were first that Macmillan was able to go on for 5 years with this before he got found out. Barber managed to go on for 2 or 3 years. Truss and Kwarteng were done within a week. That's the first point. The second point is that this seems to be a fine old conservative tradition. I'd be interested in your reactions to that thought.
I wonder if the sterling constraint was more important in those days. Callaghan gave an interview in, I think, about 1976, where he said, whenever there was a problem in the sterling markets, I'd call up a chap called Roy Bridge, who you may have known, who ran the foreign exchange team, and Roy would sort of sort it all out. So this was Callaghan's quote. So I think that sterling constraint was always going to limit how expansionary you could be, and there was a consensus that maintaining the Bretton Woods system and the pound, you might have to devalue, but maintaining the fixed value of the pound kind of kept you, in a sense, not too far away from the straight and narrow. But no, I absolutely agree. There's a history of conservative dashes for growth, and they never end particularly well. But you are limited in your constraints while you've got that fixed rate constraint.
And I think the other part of your point was interesting in the sense that you said that Macmillan got away with it for a certain number of years, Barber got away with it, and I think that does point to a change within the Conservative Party, which is the decline of deference and hierarchy within the Conservative Party. I mean, Liz Truss was particularly vulnerable, I think, to that, obviously, because she did not get anywhere near a majority of Conservative MPs to vote for her, although actually she did get a fair number of them in the end to endorse her once it became obvious she was going to win. But that actually didn't in the end do her much good when the crunch point came. So I think it is much more difficult now for Conservative Party leaders, particularly if they don't have that legitimacy, to tough it out in the way that was possible back then. I think, as we can see, I'm not sure it's true to say that the Conservative Party is ungovernable now. I know that's very fashionable to say, but it is certainly far more difficult to manage than it ever used to be. And I think that is a problem, perhaps, for economic policy. I mean, whether you regard the economic policy that's being pursued as sensible or not, I suppose one might like to feel that at least the majority, or clear majority of the party in power, was somehow behind that economic policy. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, it was obviously difficult for Margaret Thatcher in the early 80s, in the sense that there was some doubt about whether what she was doing was correct. I'm not actually sure that Margaret Thatcher could have survived 1981 had she been the leader of the current Conservative Party, and the way that, as I say, deference and hierarchy has declined.
Question? Yeah, please.
So a question about for Duncan about the power of the markets, and linked in a way, I think, because Tim suggested that the Labour Party might be significantly constrained by the outcome of the September 22 crisis and the increasing debt, public sector debt as a result. But if you look at the Jeremy Hunt budget, we're still left with, as the Financial Times described it this morning, eye-watering levels of debt, with a huge amount of public sector borrowing for the next 2 or 3 years. We've got a budget that's been given the OBR seal of approval. We've got a fiscal target which, when you read it, when you look at it, is pretty feeble. Public sector debt declining in a 5-year time frame, which is pushed forward every year. It seems to me that the markets can be fooled pretty easily, because they seem to have accepted that level of borrowing and that fiscal rule without much of a qualm for the moment. So surely there's lots that Labour can do within the same level of constraint.
And yet yields have fallen significantly since the end of September. So the market seems much happier buying gilts at current yields than it was a month ago. I think it comes back to this notion of credibility. Yes, it's a very loose fiscal rule, and you can push it back 5 years, and I'm sure it will continue to get pushed back again and again.
Clearly, lessons for Labour at that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Credibility.
I don't have any insights into current economic planning within the Labour Party, and I suspect it's fairly fluid at the moment, given where we are. But just to comment on the level of the debt, actually, if you go back, to the start of the national debt in 1694, we're pretty much at the average. Now, okay, we've had long periods since 1694 where we've had pretty strict capital controls in place that have allowed us to run, a higher debt level. But I will relay a conversation I have with every, I'm not an economist, but a conversation I've had with every professional economist that I've known over the last 10 years is, why do we look at debt to GDP? One's a stock and one's a flow. Yes. What we should look at is the cost of servicing the debt. And as long as the cost of servicing the debt, I mean, if we go back to the interwar period, the government was spending about a third of all its expenditure in the late 1920s on servicing the national debt. Now that is an enormous problem. If you're spending a third of all your spending on servicing the debt, you're not building roads, you're not building hospitals, you're not building schools, you're not really adding much to economic growth. I mean, what are we at the moment? I think we've probably gone above 3%, so we're back to 4%. So historically, you've only really got into trouble historically where the debt servicing cost has got approaching double figures, up to about 10%. So as long as you can continue to afford to service it, and you've got something approaching a credible plan, I think the markets will continue to buy your gilts. And in many ways, they have to continue to buy your gilts because they've got to go into all our pension funds, and they have no choice. So, Bill, you've written a lot about financial repression. I mean, financial repression is forcing my pension fund to buy gilts.
There's a question? Yes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is Yuan, who is a lecturer from UCL. I think I want to link my question back to our discussion of Lee Kuan Yew, because when I was reading his autobiography, he compared, because he really sits in a position where he knows the Western system very well. He himself is educated, and Singapore has also...
Sorry, whose biography?
Lee Kuan Yew.
Oh, Lee Kuan Yew, right, yes.
Yes. So he knows both the Asian world and the Western world very well, and because of his own education, the British system, the connection between Singapore and the UK, and he said specifically that talked about the government officials, especially the Prime Minister, top-level politicians in the UK, and he's comparing the current British politicians with those who ruled the world during the Empire time. And I'm not praising the Empire, but he says that the quality, when we talk about competency of politicians, he said those politicians are properly trained for the job, because they started with this kind of a comprehensive training in, for example, PPE is a British Oxford tradition, and they send all these people who overseas, and they stay in the local area for quite a long time. Britain, because I do area studies, like I do China studies, Indian studies, but also look at Asia in general. So we know that there are very famous, almost scholars who set up the foundation, say, for South Asian studies and also for these area studies and in these areas during the colonial period of time. But that is not the case. If you look at the British politicians, they become very provisional, and they don't know much about the world outside. And I think that is part of the problem why Brexit happens, because if you don't have the proper education in the system, then people start to get disconnected and disillusioned, not only about Britain's position in the world, but also how you interact with the world. Because if you look at the world's economy, biggest economies, like China is the second, the US is the first, and then Japan runs up, and Korea is developing very well, India is the fourth. So you do, in order to, I think we talked a lot about the financial management of books, but think about the economy, especially after Brexit, if UK wants to develop its economy further, it needs to learn how to interact with the world economies, other economic powers beyond Britain. But as an area studies scholar myself, I don't feel the UK has manpower to do that. For example, SOAS recently just lost their teaching staff who's teaching on Japanese economic history, so the whole curriculum is not, I hope. Well, if we have colleagues from SOAS and know the subject, please correct me, but that's the information I get. And also, SOAS doesn't really have a good teaching on Chinese economic history. So these are used to be the best institute in Britain on these subjects, but gradually, especially after Brexit, it's also very difficult to get funding for any area studies because Britain, if you look at the investment landscape, it's the same. So they are shrinking the investment beyond in the, say, developing world. A lot of investment has been reshifted to Europe. So which to me, I think I'm quite concerning because I do feel that Britain is becoming more and more inward looking and gradually losing the capacity to.
So maybe Tim would like to comment on that. Are British politicians more insular, parochial than they were, say, in the 50s and 60s?
That is an interesting one. I mean, I think for the Conservative Party, and I do take your points about Brexit, the guy at the back. I mean, I don't want to blame everything on Brexit. And I mean, I think another factor, and you might correct me, in terms of sort of government spending and government debt people were worried about in the markets was presumably the energy package, which was huge, wasn't it? And
That's the two things from where I sat was you had an awful. First of all, I do think the Bank of England has lost a lot of intellectual capital from the Carney period to where we are now. They had been slow. The QT announcement the day before was a surprise in terms of what they were attempting to do. But you're absolutely right. Then you looked at the energy package and you think that's just open-ended. I have no idea how big that's going to be and how you're going to pay for it.
And it's interesting that that's been slimmed down, hasn't it, and under review. Though quite what they're going to do is anyone's guess, as you say. And to respond to your point, I mean, I think it is true to say of many Conservative politicians that they are very, if this is a word, Anglo-spherical, in the sense that they look across the Atlantic. They often look, particularly when it comes to immigration policy, to Australia. Their connections, I think, with Europe have been gradually dwindling over time. Not just actually as a result of Brexit, but way before Brexit. And I'm not sure that they do have a kind of understanding of Asia, whether south or southeast, that they need. I mean, I think anybody who seriously thought that we would be able to pull off a quick and advantageous deal with India or with China, was fooling themselves, or even actually with the United States was fooling themselves. And yet, there was this illusion, I think, among Conservative politicians that was the case. Whether it has to do with their formation, I don't know. I mean, a very good, interesting book and read on this would be Simon Cooper's, K-U-P-E-R's book called Chums, in which he looks at the formation of British politicians and in particular Conservative politicians, and I think it does point to something you're talking about really, which is in some ways although you've not praised the empire but talked about the empire, he would suggest it goes back to a reading of history that is very, if you like, empire-centric among those politicians.
Thank you. It's Mario Stanley from the Treasury History Society. Two questions, if I may.
Yeah.
The first is, I'm interested in the institutional issues primarily. So I wonder whether if you go back to some of the other crises of economic policy, you could comment on the extent to which the official side advised ministers about the risks. I suppose you might want to think about not only the Treasury but also the bank. And then my second question was on 1967, which I thought was really interesting. And another parallel that I see there is the setting up of the Department of Economic Affairs as a way of tackling Treasury outflows. Whether you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I could say something about what the rest of the sort of British institutional macroeconomic executive, as Douglas Ross used to refer to, were doing in 1972. And the bank and Douglas Ross, it's Douglas Allen, I'm sorry, I think I'm the secretary in 1972, they were very worried. So when the Chancellor presented this very expansionary budget, aiming for 5% growth, the Governor and the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury essentially forced the Chancellor to sign off on what became the first internal money supply target in the Treasury. The letter's there in the archive, because they said you're going to have very loose fiscal policy. We need you to have a 20% That was the number that Charles Goodhart and his people had calculated. We need you to have an internal 20% growth money supply target because we don't want, this is going to be inflationary, it's going to be expansionary. On the 1992 question, well, fortunately, I had a former student in the audience here who knows much more about what official advice was leading up to 1992. And Lucas, you can tell us that pretty much there was a consensus, I think, in favour of joining the RM in 1992. So was anybody opposing that?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the spotlight.
Many other people.
Yeah.
So, from what I looked like, there seemed to be quite a bit of consensus among the systems, although there was some skepticism at the Bank of England. But they weren't quite buying that this is such a good idea. They were more like consensus in a sense, okay, it seems politicians really want to do it. We had this debate like over and over again for more than a decade. We kind of ran out of ideas what to do about inflation that increased to, again, almost double digits after the Lockson boom. So it was kind of like, going with the flow, but with quite a lot of skepticism on the Bank of England side. In the Treasury, I think there were officials that kind of fell out of the top circle that were also more skeptical about the RM, like in the mid-1980s. And then, the consensus of those who were still there in these positions by early 1990s was like, yeah, I mean, that's the one option we have left. Other countries in Europe are doing that. It will be very important politically. The Chancellor, John Major, the new Chancellor, John Major, as he was appointed, he really sees this as an important thing to tackle inflation. And the media was behind that. The business lobbies were behind that. The Labour Party turned out behind that. So it seemed to have been a consensus, but a bit of a consensus by a flow and by the dynamic, maybe less so by conviction.
We'll start from the rate, though. Particularly as it got past 1990, was disagreed about the rate being on 2.95. There was increasing suggestions of revaluation. So where would that go?
Yeah, so I mean that was perhaps a much bigger issue, that the rate itself rather than the decision to join, and that was what they had to try.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think you raise an important issue. In some ways, Truss and Kwarteng's critique of the Treasury, as you hint, is the end of a long line in some senses of critiques of the Treasury as an institution, of which the DEA was supposedly an embodiment. I mean, it's difficult to know whether the failure of the DEA was the fault of the concept in the first place, that you could somehow set up a rival department, or whether having done that you got a drunk to run it. Who knows what the history would have been had there been someone a little bit more, let's say, conventional than George Brown. But I mean, there is a very big difference, I think, between on the one hand, a critique of the Treasury, which does go back a long way, as you say, and on the other, undermining the Treasury, belittling the Treasury, getting rid of the Treasury Permanent Secretary, talking about Treasury orthodoxy as abacus economics and that kind of thing, which I think would have just been completely impossible for politicians of an earlier era, and I think speaks to. What was someone saying? We can. Sorry?
Macmillan did the same thing.
Okay.
But it's on the Constitution. It's a gross breach of the Constitution.
Yeah.
Oh, we have. We have an unwritten one. Of course we do. Massive constitutional law. That's terribly wrong thing to say.
Okay. Well,
You're supposed to, I'm afraid.
But I think that speaks to a kind of wider problem in some sense that the Conservative Party has, to bring it back to the politics, which is the kind of spread of populism within the Conservative Party, which has to some extent, I think, incentivised a kind of critique of traditional institutions as a kind of incarnation of the liberal elite, of the blob, as the establishment, sclerotic, whatever. Seeing them not as kind of checks and balances, but as vital parts of the governance of Britain, but as obstacles created by people to frustrate, or by the sort of liberal elite to frustrate the will of the people. And I think Truss and Kwarteng's belittling of the Treasury, although perhaps there are antecedents, you might be right. In some senses was a symptom of that. In terms of who was advising in the 1960s, obviously Wilson did have his own advisor. Tommy, I never know how to pronounce it. Balog, okay. I always thought it was Balog, but I didn't want to say it just in case it was horrendously wrong. But yeah, from what I recall, Tommy Balog was not keen on devaluation. The Treasury at the beginning wasn't keen on devaluation, but people within the Treasury changed their minds over time between 64 and 67 when they became convinced that it was the only way out. And in some ways, I think by the time devaluation occurred in 1967, it occurred in part because Wilson and Callaghan were able to say to the Americans and to the international markets, look, we've tried absolutely everything. There absolutely is no alternative to this, and to some extent, therefore, that the punishment meted out to the British government for devaluing was not what it might have been had it occurred in 1964.
Thank you very much. I want to bring in some people. Lady 30, yes, please. And then, yeah.
Yes, I wanted to go back to the question of competence, because I think, in a sense, it wasn't so much that the 23rd showed that they were incompetent. It was because they were incompetent, they did not get any benefits of any doubt. I mean, none of the other crises, including the 1970s one, which in some ways worse because you had the IMF literally in the building, none of them produced the resignation of the Prime Minister. None of them lost the government within, 2 weeks. And that was really, and none of them, frankly, was as incompetent as Truss. I mean, whatever one may think of any one of Heath, Macmillan, Wilson, Major, they were not at a level which anyone who watched the Trade Department would have put to Truss. So wasn't it partly that this was a completely unforced error? There were reasons for the others, and the reasons and the reactions were to the policy, not to the people. Whereas this one was very much a reaction to the people.
So I'd like to sort of take that a bit further, because I think it's a really interesting point. And again, that Nick Robinson documentary, it seemed that every time they opened their mouths, they kind of undermined their confidence a little bit further. But then, they also undermined confidence when they stayed silent, when they stayed off the media. So is this about, what does that tell you about the kind of, 24-hour news? Is that something Macmillan, didn't have to face? How do you kind of dig your way out of that crisis? Tim?
Well, I guess the answer is clearly you don't. No, I mean, I think that is a good point. I mean, clearly, when you look at Liz Truss, she had, let's say, communication difficulties. She wasn't the smoothest of communicators. She wasn't someone who could think on her feet. And in some senses, I think Kwasi Kwarteng's personality was a problem as well, in the sense that he combined, what some people saw as incompetence with arrogance, which is never a great mix. I mean, that's not to say that politicians of yore were not arrogant, but I think they weren't quite as much as he was. Now, whether that comes from being an economic historian, perhaps there are other panelists concerned.
An economic historian of the 1690s. Just on the point of competence, I mean, so Bernard Donahue, Lord Donahue, referred to the cabinet discussions that preceded, the IMF deal in 1976 as the high point of cabinet government. And there was a really wonderful Granada TV program that was made, which is on YouTube now, where the journalists, so the financial editor of the Financial Times, the economics editor of the Times, they play the politicians who were leaking to them, and it's an absolute. I thought it was an absolutely fantastic documentary, because there was a whole series of cabinet meetings where they did discuss the alternative economic strategy with Tony Benn and Peter Shaw and other people, and they thrashed it out. And you had, to use a cliche, big beasts in the cabinet, and there were alternatives. And Callaghan let them, present the alternatives, and they did talk it out. So the communication was there, and there was lots of. I wrote an article a few years ago on the press in the IMF crisis, and there was clearly Treasury leaking to their particular client journalists, and the Prime Minister was leaking to his client journalist, who was at the FT. But the communication was much, much better, and you had this, in the autumn of 1976, you had this incredible debate in the letters page of the Times, because that was, I suppose, the Twitter sort of its time, where you had about half a dozen Nobel laureates in economics thrashing out these issues, saying, well, should we be imposing spending cuts, or should we be raising taxes, or should we be introducing money supply targets? And you've got, Caldor and Cairncross and all these people sort of duking it out, and you just didn't see any of that. In September. So I think there was a huge difference in the quality of the communication, and you can see that these people were thinking about these big issues in the 1970s. Just going back to the lady who spoke earlier on, and to misquote something that Deng Xiaoping didn't say about Western civilization, more professional politicians, well, that would be a nice idea, wouldn't it? And in a sense, haven't we got more professional politicians, given that there's this well-trodden path through a PP degree through the Conservative Research Department or the Labour equivalent? So in a sense, we've got these more professional politicians, but what do they know of England who only know England? Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? And I'm sorry, I've got one more anecdote here, because another former student of mine was on the Australian trade negotiating team. And, without being too impolite about the people who were sitting on the opposite side of the table, he said they were very amateurish. And the reason for that was that we haven't had to negotiate any trade deals for the last half century, because that's all been looked after over there. So to me, it's not much wonder that there was a sort of naive optimism that these trade deals were just going to sort of fall into our laps, because they didn't know how difficult all of this was to actually get done.
Gentlemen here, yeah.
Thank you very much. Going back to the 60s, one thing I don't think we've really mentioned is that for all of the problems that the Labour government had in 67 and of course the electoral humiliation in 1968, they very nearly won the 1970 election. Let's not forget that everybody, including the Conservatives, expected the Labour government to win. Now, turning to the current situation, Rishi Sunak was very, very critical throughout the leadership campaign of Liz Truss's proposals. So although his party would like to say so, he could say, I told you so. So my question is it possible to consider, bearing in mind there probably won't be an election for a couple of years, that by that time inflation would have gone down? And although I personally feel that the Conservatives will lose, is it possible that they will lose, but not quite so badly as recent polls have suggested?
Yeah, and given that electoral politics is far more volatile now than it seems to have been in the past.
Well, I certainly think that that's clearly the plan, and the plan is to do what governments have done after 1992, after 1967, and stay in there as long as possible, and grow the economy as smoothly as possible, as reliably as possible, and to be rewarded by voters for so doing. I think the competence shock, however, of a devaluation, and in this case, this mini budget is so great that I think it will be quite difficult for the Conservative Party to dig itself out of that particular hole. Not least because there is no one to blame but themselves, as we've already stressed. But certainly, it's not entirely impossible. But I think in some ways the Conservative Party is now looking back to the 1990 to 92 period for inspiration, and looking at what John Major was able to do after the replacement of Margaret Thatcher. But I'm afraid I think they're probably going into a kind of 1997 election with a 1992 approach, and I think probably we'll end up with a result somewhere between those two, which is a pretty safe prediction.
We've probably got time for one final question. Yeah.
Going back to the issue about labour, there's never been a better time to make a case for a green revolution. If this was Gordon Brown, borrow to invest, would that go down better? Have they got more wiggle room with a good case for borrowing to invest in something sensible?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, but I think in some ways it goes back to what we were saying before, is that borrowing has become a really dirty word, even though, as you say, it's not actually a particularly a terribly high burden at the moment. But in terms of politically, and partly I think because of George Osborne's success in talking about maxing out the credit card and all that kind of thing, that it has become quite difficult even to make that kind of classic Brown argument that it's one thing to borrow for current spending, but another thing to borrow for capital spending and to invest. So I would like to think it was the case, partly because I believe it should be the case, but politically, electorally, I think very difficult.
I don't have any insights into Labour Party policy, and I didn't get where I am by predicting possible future election results. But I think it's absolutely right that Harold Wilson expected to win the 1970 election. He did not expect to win the 1974 election. Yeah. And I think that's why the Labour government was, what's the name, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury said, that's why that Labour government had no coherent macroeconomic policy, because Wilson didn't expect to win. The interesting thing for me going into the next election, this is purely a personal thing as a Scot, is going to be whether the Labour Party, how reliant the Labour Party is going to be on SNP support. And that may have changed. I mean, when Labour was 30 points ahead or whatever it was in the polls a month or so ago, it looked like they would not be, that threat of all those election posters from last time with, was it Ed Miliband in Ahmed Sam's pocket? I can't remember which election that was. We had about 3 elections but that particular sort of symbol didn't have much salience immediately after. But it might have increasing salience if that poll gap narrows going in, and that was a very powerful campaigning point, I think, for the Conservative Party.
Well, thank you all. We've worked, Tim and Duncan, very hard indeed. But it's been a fantastic discussion, and thank you all for contributing to that. It's been wonderful, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Have a great Christmas.